Good morning and welcome to the Point. It's been an interesting week, to say the least. First, with the legislature passing all but one budget bill for the entire state in one day, not even a full day. They were done by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The governor and legislature had disengaged. They had not been negotiating since she walked away from the table over road funding that she didn't want in the budget. She wanted to deal with that separately after the budget was done. Nonetheless, the Republican-led legislature with Democratic help passed all of the budget bills and sent them to the governor. After that, she issued a release that said in part, quote, "These budgets are a mess. After taking time off for a 2-month summer vacation and a weekend getaway on Mackinac Island, Republicans are playing more shell games with the state budget so they can buy a phony talking point that they're spending record money on roads." The quote continued in that release, "This backwards plan to cut funding from our departments to pay for roads is exactly how we got in this mess in the first place, and it won't do a damn thing to actually solve the problem." End of quote. The governor clearly was not on board, and we haven't heard from her directly since the legislature decided to go it alone without her input. Then, Friday afternoon, a letter surfaced, and it seems to change everything. It was distributed to state workers and said in part, quote, "I know this uncertain process has caused a lot of needless anxiety. With just days left before the start of a new fiscal year, the legislature has now presented the governor with all of the department budgets. Planning and preparation for a potential state government shutdown can stop. The notice of temporary layoff provided last week is rescinded. There will be no temporary layoffs on October 1st as a result of a government shutdown. You should report for work at your regularly scheduled time. This has been an extremely challenging budget cycle. The governor and state budget office staff will be working around the clock this weekend to finish getting all the budgets ready. The governor will be exercising her powers to get our budget into the best possible shape," end quote. Now, that would certainly seem to indicate the governor is not going to wholesale veto the budget and raises the possibility she may try to significantly change the budget with her line item veto authority. This development came after the interviews for this week's shows were already completed. With both of my guests, I went to considerable lengths to explain we were talking about these budgets without the knowledge of what the governor would do. This morning, we have a better indication. So I've omitted as many of those explanations as possible and start with Republican Representative Greg Van Workum and the very basics. Here's what: 16 budgets have been passed by the House and by the Senate. Many of them in a bipartisan way, yep. Obviously not with a lot of Democrats, but some Democrats on board. And they have been sent to the governor. And when I say sent to the governor, they don't go automatically. And I think it's something that people should know, is that the governor hasn't just had these and not taken any action. It takes time because they have to go back and be reread. You go through every bill, make sure every sentence is right, make sure a comma doesn't change the purpose of what you were trying to do. So it takes a while to get them to her, so it's not like she's been dragging her feet on these things. Before we get to all the speculation, let's talk about what we know. This is your first time through the budget process here. You worked in Washington, D.C., you watched the budget process there. Your comment was, this is quite a bit different, and it is, because you have to get one done every year for one thing, and it has to be a balanced budget. But you ended up with a big budget, very important budget for the state of Michigan, the agriculture budget. So tell me about that process. What was it like for you to come in? Obviously, agriculture very important in your district and so many districts around the state, and kind of a tough year for farmers. So there were a lot of things going on.
Yeah, agriculture very important to particularly West Michigan, Northern Michigan, but the entire state. Second leading industry in the state. Process, we took our time. We did all the hearings. It's not like we're to one point here. This has been a whole year in the making of doing the hearings, sitting down with the community, with the department, hearing what their issues are, what's happening internally, what's happening externally, and then you craft that budget. So we passed our first budget back in, I believe, April or so, and then just at the conference, and then we just had the conference recently and finished that up. So when we passed in the full House in June, you kind of saw where the House was and where the Senate was, and then over the summer we worked on negotiating to get to that conference agreement, which passed this past week.
And that's the important part to remember about this. Now, I'm not defending the timeline one way or the other, except to say that budgets did get passed before the summer recess took place, but there was no negotiated agreement between legislative leaders and the governor, and for that matter, there was no agreement between the House and the Senate. So that was some of the process that had to go along, and when it finally did, when you finally passed those budgets out, Democrats and Republicans, as I pointed out at the top of the show, both cooperated in that effort. So that passed all of the budgets out, and when you look at that, obviously you're in the majority, but when you look at those budgets as a whole, do they adequately reflect the priorities of your caucus and what you think they should be for the state, given that the state is pretty financially healthy right now?
So we're actually in a surplus position right now, whereas before, when we had the lost decade and a shutdown in the past, we were at a budget deficit. We're in a completely different place right now. And that's the difference between that state government and the federal government. We have balanced budgets. The federal does not. So we have to come together and come up with a solution on this. So the budgets, we worked with our Democrat colleagues. We wanted to work with the governor, but she decided to step away from those negotiations. So what we put together in these conference reports was talking with our Democrat colleagues, both in the House and the Senate, to make sure they were involved. And that's why you saw a lot of them pass with a bipartisan support.
Let's talk about transportation specifically, because that's one of those areas that has been a point of contention. The governor had a plan to raise gasoline taxes by 45 cents per gallon at the pump. At some point, she and legislative leaders said, you know, this is holding up our budget negotiations. So everybody agreed, we're going to set this over here, and we'll get back to this later. By the way, Senate Majority Leader says he will get back to it later. Then those budget conversations went on, but not for very long, a few days, and they broke off, and that's when the legislature announced they would more or less go it on their own. So talk to me about that transportation budget, because it is an increase, but it's a one-time money increase, right?
Yeah, so this budget will accelerate the plan that was put in 2015. So we're adding about $400 million more to our previous year budget, which is a significant amount of money when you're talking about state dollars. And on my drive to Lansing, I'm sure your drive as well, you're seeing those orange barrels up. People are seeing that we are putting those dollars into roads to fix and repair them. And from a lot of our perspective, we want to see that plan get fully implemented and get us to that point where we're seeing that actual progress. So this bill accelerates that plan, but as you said, Senator Shirkey and Speaker Chatfield have been very vocal in saying we'll continue these negotiations in this process to make sure that we've got long-term road funding as part of this plan. But another interesting part of this is, yeah, we can throw some more dollars at transportation, but we also have to look at the reform side as well and how we're building our roads and what we can do on that cost-saving side so that these projects don't cost as much and those dollars go further. It's looking at that value side as well.
Well, when you think about the overall transportation budget, how much money, I mean, we're talking about the extra, how much money is in a transportation budget?
So we're at, I believe, $5.2 billion now in the transportation budget. So since that 2015 legislation, we've added about $4.3 billion more into our roads. That's a lot of money in a very short time frame.
Is there an active movement to get to some of those reforms you speak of, about how you're building roads and the efficiencies, how long they last? Because we have heard for forever that Ohio or Indiana or Pennsylvania is doing something that we're not doing. And I sat through some hearings with Representative O'Malley, I believe, who was holding those. And they were, you would think it would be pretty dry, but it was pretty interesting stuff about what some of the unique problems are building roads in Michigan. Are we getting any closer on that, finding the best practices?
Yeah, I hope anything that we put in front of the governor is going to have a portion of that talking about the reforms. We've got a very unique set of circumstances here in Michigan because of our freeze-thaw cycle that we have here, because of that beautiful lake that we all enjoy causes some problems as it relates to transportation that other states just don't experience. So we have to take a different look at our roads. We have to figure on that we're going to have to be repairing them, and then start looking at those materials to say, okay, if this is a reality that we live in, how are we going to build our roads and adjust so that we can make sure we're spending taxpayer dollar wisely?
When you think about what was done with the education bill, K through 12 education bill, and some very loud concerns about what was done with higher education, which was a pretty small increase compared to some of the other things that happened, are all of these silos getting filled in the way that they ought to? In other words, there was pretty impassioned speech over in the Senate talking about at a time when higher education is important, and when there are all these changes that are going on, and at a time when the state has money, that they aren't, from the Democratic perspective, putting enough money into something like higher education.
Each member is going to have their own priorities and where they came from, what their priorities on the campaign trail were, what they have been selling to their constituents. So there's going to be passion on all different fronts. What we saw from the governor, and I think what you saw from us, education, we're raising the per pupil funding allowance to $240. It's the most money we've put in education ever before. Transportation, which we talked about, is receiving a significant increase. One of the governor's priorities was clean water. We're putting $120 million into a clean water fund, which relates to the PFAS issue. So you're seeing a lot of these issues taken care of. A lot of these issues that were priorities are getting significant increases. You mentioned education. One of the things I'm passionate about is childhood literacy. And there was a significant boost to fund literacy coaches in our school system so that we can get those kids to that third grade reading age and get them passed. So there's a lot of different elements in this, a lot of different priorities, and that's where you have those negotiations. That's where you have those compromises. That's why you need everyone at the table to figure that out.
Up next, another look at the budget from a different viewpoint. State Representative Rachel Hood joins us next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point, where we're talking about the budget, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen with it. Another representative with me this morning, Democrat Rachel Hood from Grand Rapids. Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
In our first segment, we talked to a freshman lawmaker, a Republican who had never been through the budget process before. I wanted to get your take because obviously, from his standpoint, he thought the budgets met some priorities and they would have been passed through and they got some Democratic votes. And so now we'll wait to see what the governor's going to do with them. But from your perspective, before we get into why you didn't like some of these budgets, what was the process like? Now, you've been around this a little bit, other places, but this is the first time as a state representative that you actually had to sit down and go through this budget process. What was that like? Is that a pretty steep learning curve?
It was a steep learning curve, but I have to say that the staff that work for the state of Michigan and the House Fiscal Office are phenomenal, and their ability to bring information in front of us, deliver a clear, concise, and brief picture of all of the detailed aspects of the budgets, help us analyze those budgets was really extraordinary. We have amazing people, brilliant people working with us, a dedicated team who have been with us for decades. We will, in the coming years, have some retirements in the office, and I'm confident, though, that there's a really wonderful foundation set. And moving forward, the budget process itself can only improve. Now,
can I stop you right
that
there? That
doesn't count for politics.
No, well, that's right.
in the process.
And we'll get to that. But I wanted to say something about the nonpartisan staff in the House and Senate Fiscal Office.
Yes.
They have been there, as you point out, forever. Not all of them, but I mean,
Right.
it's that department, that agency is always there. And I, as a reporter, use that same resource to go in and get clarity, because as you were about to point out, politically these things can be spun in a lot of different directions. But if you want a real black and white view, that's a good place to look to get a handle on what the budget really looks like. And it does a year-to-year comparison, which is also helpful when somebody says, well, you're not spending more or you're spending less or whatever it is. So you've got that. So I just wanted to clarify that that's something that's out there that actually folks at home can access to.
It's a resource for everybody, but I'll warn that it really fails to be digestible for most folks. And I think that's a place where the state could improve in terms of increasing transparency, of course, has been a big part of the dialogue. I don't think the budget process is as transparent as it could or should be. And other states have created models that clearly delineate to communities through graphics, through new practices and data and informatics. We can begin to deliver more information for our communities to help people follow along in the process. And at this time in government, I think everybody is looking for those opportunities. We're realizing that we all as citizens need to be more active in these processes. We need to make sure our values are being translated into these budgets, and I think there are a lot of people out there who are thirsty for this information, including myself before I was elected. Before we began taping, I shared with you that I was working with state budgets across the country, and I saw a lot of different states with way better materials than what Michigan has been providing.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that going forward I think you and your colleagues will be working on, because transparency, as you point out, was a big issue in the last election cycle, and it's not going to go away. Let's talk about these budgets a little bit. And I don't know what order you may have them in, but I'm going to ask you about a couple off the top. And I want to start first with the K through 12, the education budget that was passed out before this past Tuesday. It was passed out the Thursday before, right?
Right.
And then all of the rest, the other 15 budgets on this past Tuesday. Tell me about the education bill, where it hits and where it misses, or maybe it misses altogether.
Sure. Well, the education bill was a bill that I voted for despite some concerns. But I felt like my job was to keep the process moving forward, and there were enough kind of good pieces of meaningful material in the school aid fund budget that I could vote yes. That was tripling investments in English as a second language learning, doubling investments in special ed, where the state has been significantly challenged and under federal review. And then we also had increases in per pupil spending in many districts, not all. But I represent the city of Grand Rapids, and Grand Rapids Public Schools, they were very happy with the budget as a step forward. I think we know from a lot of wonderful studies that have been invested in, that have received bipartisan participation and support, that we need to be at $9,500 annually in per pupil spending. And right now we're hitting, I would say on average, about $8,000. So we still have $15,000 per pupil to go. But we made some leaps in this budget. It's probably not realistic that we're going to be able to leap to $9,500 in one budget year, and certainly not given the leadership in the legislature, in the State House and Senate.
So this was one that you could vote for, despite the fact that you would have liked to seen some changes. There is no perfect budget.
Yeah, some of the problems in the budget were a series of kind of pork barrel contracts to out-of-state vendors that provide widgets and tools that schools can use but don't necessarily use. And some of those are legacy investments that were instilled in the budget from past leaders who had relationships with these vendors. Education is big business. I think that's a space where the governor can use her veto pen to improve the education budget and perhaps move some dollars back to our high schoolers, which is one place I would say the next most important investment we need to make. In addition to that, there has been investment in Michigan in cyber schools. So these are schools that don't have physical spaces. Therefore, it is less expensive to run and operate those those facilities, those school operations. And the Democratic caucus feels that we could make some cuts to that portion of the budget by say 10 or 20% in order to generate a few more million for our high schoolers.
One of the things that will be tested, I suspect, when that line item veto pin comes out is how far she can go with moving those funds or doing anything with them. And that conversation has already begun. We won't get into it today because we don't yet know what's going to happen as you and I sit here.
Yes.
But I do want to talk about one more budget, and then I want to, in general, just get your take on whatever else you liked or didn't like. Transportation budget was at issue because the governor said she wasn't interested in using one-time money in that transportation budget and instead wanted to wait and have the larger conversation about money in roads and the long-term fix, and she wanted to do that after the budget, after they realized they weren't going to get to that beforehand.
Right.
Where were you on transportation, and what is good, if anything, or bad in it?
Yes. So I was a no on transportation. I have concerns about some boilerplate language that harms our unions. We need talented, well-trained, professional union workers to help us make these investments in roads over the next decades. We need to support their ability to get the kind of benefits they need from these opportunities, this investment in roads. Some other concerns, obviously I share the concern that there isn't a long-term revenue solution for our roads, and in fact we're taking money from other parts of the budget to backfill roads, and there's about a $400,000 or $400 million problem, excuse me, there. I'm also concerned about the lack of investment in public transportation. We need to begin to really invest in public transportation. We're way behind other states. Of course, Michigan's legacy of individual automobiles and the American dream, right? We failed to invest in infrastructure to support public transit and in operating funds for public transit. This will damage our ability to compete for federal funding as well. For groups like the Rapid to be able to obtain state matches that help draw down 3 or 4 times more in federal funding. And it puts a pinch on the growth that we've seen in local transit services, slows that down, and that ultimately hurts people. More and more single vehicle families, and those folks need other options to be able to get to jobs, and our kids need options to get to school.
We are going to be out of time in about a minute.
Okay.
That's how quickly this goes. Is there one other thing that stands out to you in this budget that was either a success or you think a big miss?
Yeah, I think some of the poison pills include cuts to the Attorney General's office and to the Secretary of State. In DHHS, we saw a lot of tinkering with healthcare access, particularly for women. We have some concerns about the lack of investment in technology, and that includes cyber defense. That failed investment and a 25% across the board cut on technology with additional cuts to DMTB could make us really vulnerable to significant technology problems in the future.
Representative, I am fascinated to talk to you more about this because I know you came very well prepared, and I appreciate that because we're going to have a second bite at the apple, if you will, because once the governor does whatever she's going to do, then the legislature may get an opportunity to do something in a supplemental fashion or maybe even complete rewrites. So I hope you'll come back and talk to us when we get ready to do that.
I'll be ready to do that, and I know our governor wants me to pass forward to the people of West Michigan that she is going to be working all day and all night until Monday at midnight to make sure that this budget goes through and that we continue operating Michigan's governance.
Representative, thank you. We'll be back
you.
with more To the Point. So now we wait. The governor will likely not do anything publicly until Monday. The legislature is not scheduled back in Lansing until Wednesday, though they are prepared to come back sooner if necessary. But going back to the top of the show, it may not be necessary. If the governor doesn't veto complete bills, if she doesn't make moves to shut down government, Wednesday may be plenty early to continue this fight over the budget. And be sure this fight will continue. We'll see what the governor does on Monday. We'll follow that throughout the week on News 8, and we'll see you back here Sunday morning, 10 o'clock on Wood TV for To The Point.